Hello, everyone, and welcome to Bible study from Dinuba Presbyterian Church. It's great to be back with you after our winter break, and thanks to everyone who came to the in-person debrief event that we held at the church right at the beginning of the year as we finished off our Keep Church Weird series. We'll be having another in-person event at the conclusion of this series where we'll gather together to reflect on what we learned. So be watching in the coming weeks for more information on that and more details, and we really do hope to see you there. The season of Lent has begun, and in an ironic and perhaps even cruel twist of the calendar, Ash Wednesday and Valentine's Day were the same day this year. This is a special period in the liturgical year where we prepare our hearts to remember the events of Jesus' last week on earth before the crucifixion, and to celebrate Jesus' resurrection on Easter Sunday. For 6 weeks, God's people are called to reflect on their mortality and their inability to attain a right standing with God on their own merits. It's a penitent time of introspection and asceticism, and seems really quite the opposite of how we usually think about Valentine's Day and an extravagant celebration of love. But this confluence of Lent and Valentine's Day can also be an opportunity to reflect on the nature and meaning of love, and particularly on the love that God has demonstrated to his people. There's truly no greater love story than the story of how God has loved us and made us his people. It's a story of high drama, betrayal, redemption, reconciliation, and hope, which makes this Lenten Valentine's Day season the perfect time, I think, to launch into a study of the Old Testament prophet Hosea. He is one of the oddest, perhaps most intense, and most prophetically significant love stories in the Bible, and it's a reflection of that greater story of God's unwavering love for us. This study will be for 6 weeks, and this will take us all the way to Easter. And we begin this week with an introduction to the historical situation of the book and a look at this primary imagery that it employs as it explores the issues of the unfaithfulness of God's people and God's faithfulness to them. Now, as a word of warning, if you are watching today with younger Bible scholars, you may want to visit some of our earlier studies until you've had a chance to review this one and make sure that they will be ready for what we will be discussing from this rather intense book. God called Hosea in an era of increased and significant prophetic activity in the divided kingdoms of Israel and Judah. Just a bit more than 1,000 years before Jesus was born, the nation of Israel, who God had rescued from slavery in Egypt and brought into the promised land, demanded that God appoint a king over them so that they could be just like all the other nations surrounding them in Canaan. It was thought that a king could bring true political unity among the 12 tribes that comprised the nation of Israel. And in the case of David, the second king of Israel, this turned out to be true. After a long struggle with King Saul, David took the throne and established a united kingdom that would flourish economically and politically during the reign of his son, Solomon. Now, by the way, I am severely glossing over the succession battles surrounding the end of David's life, in particular the rebellion of his son Absalom. But for more information on the intrigues and the civil conflicts and the political infighting of ancient Israel, you can turn to 2 Samuel and 1 Kings. When Solomon dies, the political unity among the 12 tribes is severely tested, and ultimately it does fail. There are multiple issues involved in the dissolution of the united Israel: jealousy among the tribes, particularly of Judah, an unsustainable system of conscripted labor, and most significantly, disputes over the site at which God was to be worshipped and where the festivals were to be observed and the ceremonies of Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, were to be conducted. The presence of the temple in Jerusalem in the south was considered a major political advantage for the tribe of Judah, to which David and his descendants belonged. The 10 tribes to the north believed that allowing their people to travel south to worship at the temple would make those people more loyal to the tribe of Judah than to their own tribe. So they came up with an idea and one that is very significant to the story of Hosea that we will be studying. In the wake of Solomon's death, rival sites of worship were constructed in Bethel and Dan, and at the center of these alternate temples were golden statues of calves that Jeroboam, the northern king, proclaimed to be the images of the God who had rescued the people from Egypt. It's an alarming parallel to the golden calf incident in the book of Exodus, and one of the most blatant examples within the scriptures of God's people falling into idolatry. The people's demand for a king had ultimately led to civil war and societal division. A unified Israel had ceased to exist, and in its place were two kingdoms, the north, which retained the name Israel, and the southern kingdom, which retained the name Judah. Sundered from one another, God's people continued to engage in idolatry in the north and the south. For hundreds of years, God sent prophets to both kingdoms, warning them that these practices would have devastating consequences if they were not abandoned, and if the people, both the high rulers and the common folk, did not repent and return to God. About 700 years before Jesus was born, the Assyrian Empire invaded and destroyed the northern kingdom of Israel. Judah would fall to the Babylonians just over 100 years later. Hosea lived during the 8th century BC, just before the Assyrian invasion of Israel. Like many prophets of that era, he was called to speak to both Israel and Judah and warn them of the coming judgment of God, though Hosea's primary focus was on the northern kingdom. He was a contemporary of Isaiah, and it's mostly fair to consider Isaiah as Hosea's counterpart in the southern kingdom, or vice versa. But Hosea is distinct from Isaiah in that God called him not just to speak and write his message, but to be a living illustration of his prophecy in his own life. God called Hosea to marry a woman. Now, and here's where things start to get a little rated M for mature. A woman who the text describes as a whore. The language used in Hosea is very direct on this point. And here is how the book begins in the ESV translation. The word of the Lord that came to Hosea, the son of Beeri, in the days of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah, and in the days of Jeroboam, the son of Joash, king of Israel. When the Lord first spoke through Hosea, the Lord said to Hosea, "Go, take to yourself a wife of whoredom, and have children of whoredom, for the land commits great whoredom by forsaking the Lord." The text of Hosea pulls no punches on this point, though some English translations do try to soften this a little by opting for the more technical and legal word prostitute, or earlier in the King James Version, harlot. The NIV is one of the most cautious, opting to translate with the phrase promiscuous woman. Attempts to soften the language of Hosea may be grounded in good faith attempts to make the text less distressing and presumably less repellent to modern ears. But I do think that blunting the sharpness within Hosea ultimately obscures what God is saying about the seriousness of Israel's sin and their betrayal of God. As we can see in verse 2, God draws a direct parallel between this whorish activity and the collective sin of his people who have abandoned him. God likens the breach of sexual fidelity in marriage to the people's religious and spiritual infidelity as they sought after other gods, building altars to foreign deities, importing the rituals of other cultures into their own worship, and abandoning their commitment to exclusivity that God commanded at the giving of the Ten Commandments after he rescued them from Egypt. The violation of the marriage oath and the sanctity and exclusivity of that married sexual relationship is one of the most destructive, painful, and devastating situations that can arise in the realm of human relationships. It is a visceral and profoundly emotional wound that sunders everything in its path. And it's because of the enormity and complexity and the agony of sexual infidelity that God likens it to the idolatry and unfaithfulness of Israel. It's an indicator of the magnificent importance of that relationship and of the seriousness of the people's sin in abandoning God. The writings of John in the New Testament also use the language and imagery of marriage to describe the relationship of the church to Jesus, famously describing the church as the bride of Christ and depicting Jesus as the bridegroom. John leverages the happy anticipation of an impending wedding to describe the joy the church will experience when Jesus returns to earth and we are reunited with him. So this idea of using the marriage relationship and its covenantal nature as an analog for the covenant between God and his people is not isolated to the Old Testament, but remains an important thread through the time of Jesus and beyond. So with all of that in mind and all of that foundation laid, we'll continue on in the text of Hosea and we'll finish out chapter 1. This is starting in verse 3. So he went and took Gomer, the daughter of Diblaim, and she conceived and bore him a son. And the Lord said to him, Call his name Jezreel, which means God will shatter. For in just a little while I will punish the house of Jehu for the blood of Jezreel, and I will put an end to the kingdom of the house of Israel. And on that day I will break the bow of Israel in the valley of Jezreel. As a quick aside, the house of Jehu is the last dynasty of the northern kingdom of Israel. Jehu was a righteous king who killed an apostate king and fought against the worship of Baal within Israel, as we can read in 2 Kings chapter 10. But the blood of Jezreel, that is, the judgment of God on unfaithful kings, will be turned against Jehu's own descendants when Israel is judged via the coming Assyrian invasion. Jezreel becomes a sort of watchword for the cataclysmic judgment that God is preparing. And the names of Hosea's subsequent children are no less pointed. She conceived again and bore a daughter. And the Lord said to him, Call her name Lo Ruhamah, no mercy, for I will no more have mercy on the house of Israel to forgive them at all. But I will have mercy on the house of Judah, and I will save them by the Lord their God. I will not save them by bow, or by sword, or by war, or by horses, or by horsemen. When she had weaned no mercy, she conceived and bore a son. And the Lord said, Call his name Lo Ami, not my people, for you are not my people, and I am not your God. Yet the number of the children of Israel shall be like the sand of the sea, which cannot be measured or numbered. And in the place where it was said to them, You are not my people, it shall be said to them, Children of the living God. And the children of Judah and the children of Israel shall be gathered together, and they shall appoint for themselves one head, and they shall go up from the land, for great shall be the day of Jezreel. So for those of you on the lookout for good baby names for children or grandchildren in the Bible, Hosea chapter 1 may not be the best source to explore for that, but the names God commands Hosea to give his children are a continuation of the story of betrayal that Hosea's marriage also portrays, and they outline the coming experience for Israel and Judah. God will judge. That judgment will be devastating. They will feel abandoned, and God will restore them and remind them of who they are, his people. This is not an easy or particularly cheerful arc of Scripture or of the history of God's people to contemplate or study, but it is the truth of the consequences of sin among the people of Israel. And their sin is no less serious, no less caustic, no less threatening than our own sin today, collectively as a nation and individually. Biblical scholars call issues surrounding sin hamartiology, after the Greek word for sin. And it's a difficult and sensitive discussion that many would rather ignore or jettison from Christian belief. But if we refuse to recognize the seriousness of sin, if we don't have a hamartiology, we can never hope to understand the breadth and the depth and the extravagance of the love God has shown for us in forgiving us, freeing us from sin by the death and resurrection of Jesus. We are God's redeemed people, and that redemption has come with a price. And this is the overall message of Hosea that we'll be studying together over the next few weeks. The text is meant to be shocking. The command to marry Gomer is meant to be deeply troubling. But the text does not celebrate these dysfunctions and human miseries. Rather, Hosea calls us to self-reflection, to consider carefully the ways in which we betray, abandon, or disregard our call to be God's people. And most importantly, Hosea reminds us that despite our frailty and our sin, despite our relentless unfaithfulness to God, He is always faithful to us. So hopefully you can agree that Hosea makes for a great Valentine's Day Lenten study, and I hope that you'll join us for the next 6 weeks as we journey toward Easter and through this fascinating book. Next week, we will turn to chapters 2 and 3 of Hosea if you want to start reading ahead, and we'll examine more of the parallels between him and the New Testament. Until then, God bless you this week, and we'll see you next time.